The crunch of ice announced Allie's arrival behind me. She was only just in time to make the bus. It was too cold out to make pulling out my phone to check the time seem worth it. We formed a line in the order we had arrived, then trooped onto the bus. I looked at the driver. It wasn't Ruthie. She looked down at us as she opened the door and watched us get on. Her straggling blonde hair fell out of a knitted cap over her army green jacket. It was open, exposing the Penguins jersey she had underneath. I only noticed that later. At that point, I was just pleasantly blasted with the first wave of warmth from the heaters. The lights had come on when we stopped, and some of the other kids scattered around the bus looked up at us as we came on. Most were sleeping, or trying to. One girl was scrawling answers on a homework packet by the light of her cell phone. The good seats were all taken. The kids sat in patches around the two heaters. The best seats were a seat away from the heaters on both sides. The seats right above them were too hot. They would feel good for a minute, but then if you were dressed well enough for the weather, you would cook in those seats. I didn't want to be a sweaty mess. Mike Trongo was in my first period class. I sat 2 seats behind the back heater in the next to last seat. Allie sat as far away as possible, near the front. Her problem. We were almost the last stop. I closed my eyes and leaned my head against the window. Between my cap and my hair, it was enough to be a pillow, at least for 10 minutes. The bus rattled past the stop at the trailer court. The route was so familiar to me, even half conscious, I realized that we hadn't stopped. I looked out and saw the 5 kids usually there. Then I looked back and saw another bus behind us. It honked and then stopped for the kids. We seemed to speed up a bit, but then slowed as we came into the turns and the downhill leading to the highway. The light was green as we passed the beer distributor and turned the right onto the highway by the auto tag store. The light went from amber to angry glowing red in the pre-dawn darkness as my window went past it. The few headlights passing us in the other direction that early were enough to make me turn my head back towards the aisle, and soon I was only semi-conscious again. I awoke to someone saying something. It was the girl ahead of me with the homework. She was a junior, and I didn't know her name, but it made sense that she would try to point out that the driver had missed the turn to the school. She grabbed her stuff and moved towards the front of the bus. The world was becoming gray now. The sun was still behind the ridge, but close enough to level that it was banishing the darkness back to night. We would still be at school before it was fully light out, but not by much. The girl was pointing at the second turn we could make, but the driver just kept going east. The girl seemed exasperated and pulled out her phone. She played with it for a minute before putting it back in her bag. "Does anyone have a signal? Can I borrow a phone?" Some of the boys thought it was funny that we missed the 2 turns. Not even a minute later, we barreled past the last turn on the highway that could have taken us to the school, and then past the car dealership that marked the last business on the road before the next town. We were on open highway. Woods on either side of us. The road was divided here, and it was only just possible to see the headlights on the cars coming from the other direction. There were no cars going in our direction now. People started complaining and pulling out their phones. Everyone was now awake and trying to call someone. No one had a signal. When the bus turned off the road onto a dirt track, some of the guys got up to try to stop the driver, but she slammed a metal gate shut behind her, trapping us in the back. Steve Markle yelled to me, "Lauren, open the emergency exit." I got up and pulled on the handle and then tried pushing on it. It wouldn't budge. "It won't open," I yelled. A junior a seat up from me got up to try it, but he couldn't move it either. "She's right, it won't move," he said. We opened the windows and tried to climb out, but they were designed to go only so far down. They were designed to prevent exactly what we were trying to do. Bumping along the road, we were thrown around a bit in the back, and anyone not seated pretty much got dumped on their ass. After about 2 minutes, the bus stopped. Steve Markle was hammering on one of the windows with a book. The glass was shatterproof, another safety measure. When we stopped, he looked towards the front. The driver opened the door and 2 men got on. One of them had a metal stick. They were both big. One was much bigger. They opened the metal gate. They moved towards us. They grabbed the girl who had been doing her homework. Steve Markle and one of the other boys moved towards them. The second man hit him with the metal stick, and he screamed and went down. The other boy stopped. They pulled the girl towards the front of the bus with them. She struggled, but it did her no good. They slammed the gate shut again when they went through. The girl was screaming as they dragged her off the bus. This seemed to delight the men. We saw them drag her to a small cabin in the trees. We hadn't seen it until the door opened and the light shone out. The darkness was fully gone, but the lights hadn't completely reached us yet. We couldn't see the sun in the woods very well, but everything was blue-gray. A minute later, we saw the men coming back from the cabin. The door was already open and they got on. The driver watched as they opened the gate again. They went down the aisle with students cringing back in their seats. When they reached the first student, the one man hit him with the metal stick, and he screamed and went down. The other grabbed him by his left arm and jerked him into the aisle, and then dragged him off the bus. The gate slammed shut again. Steve Markle got up. "It's some sort of taser," he said. Everyone moved towards the back of the bus, and we crowded into the back 4 rows of seats. We saw the door in the cabin open again and then shut. The driver started smoking. She still hadn't said anything, but then she turned the engine off. The heaters went along with the engine, and it didn't take long before it started getting cold. Allie was sitting right behind me now. She was in the back seat, by the aisle. There were 17 of us, all crammed into those last seats. Suddenly, the emergency door flew open, and a hand reached up and grabbed Allie by the arm. They jerked her out, and her hip hit the floor before she was yanked off the bus. The door was slammed again before anyone could do anything. Allie was screaming as they dragged her towards the cabin, her shrill voice piercing even above the sobbing sounds we were making. We saw them throw her down and utter some of the only words we heard from our captors. "Shut up, bitch." As she tried to rise, the bigger one just punched her in the face. She went down, and he picked her up and threw her over his shoulder. We moved to the center of the bus after that. The driver stood there looking at us. She didn't back up. She just stood there watching, the cigarette moving in her fingers in and out of her mouth, the smoke dissipating into the cold air on the bus. No one could get a signal on their phones. We huddled together quietly, talking. Some of us just whimpered. The driver didn't try to stop us. She still just watched. Steve Markle said, "They must have some sort of jammer somewhere. John, see if you can get anything under the seats." He said, "If we can find it, we can turn it off." I didn't think it needed to be said. Sam Coria was crying. She wasn't the only one, but she was the only one openly sobbing. She was pushed against the window in the middle row of the bus, legs up as far against her chest as her heavy coat would allow. We moved around John Statler. John, so he could look under the seats. He leaned his head against the fake green leather of the bus seat in front of him and slowly moved it down until nothing was visible from the front. Then he leaned back into Christy Clymer and dropped his head under the seat. He scanned around but then popped back up when he heard the doors open again. The gate crashed open and the big man came down the aisle. Steve Markle stood up and turned to face him. "Look, I'll go with you. You don't need to drag me off," he said. The big man nodded and moved into the seat he was standing beside and let Steve Markle walk past him. The other man, the one with the stick, backed up. He had the middle stick pointed at Steve Markle as he walked. It was never more than a few feet away. The driver backed into her seat to let him pass, and as Steve Markle went past, he elbowed her right in the face. He turned and cocked his arm back. "That's for Allie." We saw him collapse and the big man was on him. We couldn't see Steve. He was down in the stairwell. We could see the big man standing above him, and his arm go out to the side as he raised his leg and brought it down. Then he did it again. Steve cried out twice, and then all we heard was the snapping and wet sounds. The smaller men moved and hauled Steve off the bus. They just left him on the dirt road. I stood up a bit and could see steam coming off his body in multiple places. He was just lying in a heap. The big man came back. He pushed Karen Ellis aside and grabbed John by the hair. Some sophomore tried to grab his hand, and the big man smashed him into the window and then dropped him over the seat one ahead of him. By the time the kid had got back up, John was halfway down the aisle, and the driver slammed the gate closed behind him. The big man pushed John's face into the cold ground, and then picked it up and turned it towards where Steve lay. He then grabbed him by the back of his jacket and hauled him to his feet, and the big man, the man with the stick, and John marched up to the cabin, which was more visible now in the early sunlight. The sophomore that the big man had slammed against the window got out of the seat he was dumped into and crouched down in front of the rest of us. "Here's what we need to do," he said. "We need to get to the back of the bus, but stay away from the sides of the back seat so that they can't grab anyone easily. We put one person on either side of the back seat but against the window so they have to come in further to get us." "Who's going to want to do that?" Karen Ellis interrupted. "I'll do it if I have to," the sophomore said. He said, "I don't care if anyone else doesn't want to, but we need someone back there to at least make it hard for them to get on the bus that way." "I don't think they're going to do that anymore anyway," I said. "It's too light out now. We'll see them coming." "Yeah," said Karen Ellis. "It won't be a surprise." The sophomore looked a little crestfallen, but went on anyway. "It doesn't matter. We need to get to the back of the bus. That gives us more time for them to come to us. Each time they come takes more time, and maybe someone will find us." "How are they going to do that, Tom?" asked some skinny blonde sophomore. "I think I saw another bus behind us." "I saw it," I confirmed. "Well, that must have been our real bus," said Tom. "Ruthie would have seen none of us at our usual stops," he said. "She would probably tell someone when the bus was empty, almost when it got to the school." "She honked at us," I added. "And there are probably people looking for us right now," said Tom. The blonde sophomore seemed mollified. "Look, not only can we delay them, but we will be in the back, and what we need to do is get behind the seats and duck down when they come on." "They're coming," someone screamed. Everyone looked. The cabin door was just shutting. Then they looked at Tom, and everyone started to move to the back of the bus. The door opened and the gate slammed again. I sat in the very back seat on the driver's side. Sam Coria sat on the other side. She wasn't crying anymore, but she didn't look like she was going to be able to do much. 3 people were crammed into each of the seats in front of us, and then 3 more in each of the seats in front of them. One kid crouched in the aisle just between the 2 seats in front of us. The kids in the seats closest to the front slid down and pushed their heads against the green fake leather of the seat in front of them. The big man came down the aisle first again. He stopped when he got to a point 1 seat ahead of where the kids were crouching. The rest of us were watching him. He pulled out a knife, a big hunting knife. Several of us screamed no, but it didn't do any good. The kids hiding behind the seats couldn't know what was happening. He stabbed it into the seat, and we heard a scream of pain. Megan Kozer fell into the aisle bleeding, and the kids in the foremost seats started scrambling to the back right over Megan. The big man stabbed another one of them, and then grabbed the last kid who tried to get away. The 2 kids closest to the windows had just hopped directly over the seats onto the kids behind them. The last kid struggled, but for only a moment. The big man put the knife against the kid's face. "Quit," he said, and it was all the command he needed. The man with the metal stick was standing on the seats directly behind the big man. The big man turned and shoved the kid down the aisle. The man with the metal stick followed the kid down and out of the bus. The big man wiped his knife off on the top of the bus seat he was standing next to, and then put it back and walked off the bus. The driver slammed the gate shut behind him. We took the coat off the one kid that got stabbed. We didn't know what the hell we were doing, but people were getting gym clothes out of bags to wrap around the wound. It seemed that the knife went through the strap of the kid's backpack and his coat, sweatshirt, and shirt under that. It made a hole, but it didn't look like a very big one. It was right over his shoulder blade, and I guess that the bone stopped it from going very deep. It was still bleeding, and the kid was sobbing. Megan wasn't sobbing or screaming at this point. She was just shaking. He had stabbed her in the head. The knife had gone through her left ear, where it was pressed against the seat and took a chunk of the skin out behind it. It was tough to see exactly what was going on because she was bleeding a lot and had some other scratches from where she had been stepped on. Tom said, "Get out anything you can that could be used as a weapon." The skinny blonde sophomore said. That's just going to piss them off even more. Shut up. They're already fucking stabbing us and doing God knows what else, I said with the authority of a senior. She did shut up. The driver just watched us still. She held a rag to her nose to stop it from bleeding, but kind of just watched us over that. She wasn't smoking anymore. They just did that to scare us, Tom said. They needed us to move from where we were, and it didn't even matter if the knife hit Megan or not. We rooted around in our bags. Most of us, what we could come up with were pencils. Of course, the school prohibits anyone from having any actual weapons. Even Swiss Army knives are off limits. Okay, so sit back in your seats, and when he tries to grab anyone, just start stabbing at him with whatever you have. Everyone needs to help, Tom said. We watched them move out of the cabin and head towards the bus. Everyone had at least a pen in their hands. One of the kids had a wooden ruler, which we broke into 2 sharp pieces. It wasn't much. I looked at the bigger man when he got on the bus. His big nose and ears, his shaved head, his black hoodie under his jean jacket. Our pens and pencils wouldn't get through that. Try to aim for his face, I said. He moved down the aisle again after swinging the gate open, pulling the knife out right as he did so. The man with the metal stick was behind the big man. He stopped again in the same place he had stopped last time. Then he moved. In 3 steps, he was past the first set of seats. We jumped up and started stabbing at him, but the man with the metal stick was behind him, and each time he touched that stick to someone, they went down. He grabbed the blonde sophomore by the upper arm and dragged her out of her seat. Tom grabbed her by the other arm and tried to keep her in place. 4 kids were down now around him. I stabbed the big man right in the side of the head with my pencil. It broke, but he was bleeding at least. The man brought his hand around faster than I could see. The knife went into Tom, where the last 2 attacks he had made with the knife were quick, almost pokes. This time he drove it home and pinned Tom back in the seat with it. Everyone was screaming. Tom let go of the girl, and the man hauled her back down the aisle. The man with the metal stick moved into his seat out of the bigger man's way. He stood there with his stick, daring any of us to come after them. No one did. Tom had collapsed into the seat. Blood was gushing out from under his jacket. He already looked pale. We got his jacket open, and the white turtleneck he had underneath was soaked. The knife had made a massive gash in it, and his stomach, where it had gone in. Nobody was talking as we looked at the wound. Tom passed out, and before the men returned, he was dead. We didn't fight anymore after that. The 4 kids that got knocked down with the metal stick were too woozy to do anything. Having Tom's body there was just a reminder of how this was going to go. We couldn't fight them. There were only 11 of us now. No one had spoken since they came and took the blonde. They were back. Karen Ellis had been one of the kids that had been knocked down by the metal stick. She was still sitting in the 3rd seat from the back of the bus. They came on and grabbed her. The big man put his arm around her neck as he dragged her down the aisle. She was crying. We all looked away. The driver shut the gate again as the 2 men moved off the bus. She closed it lazily now. She knew we weren't going to try to rush her off or anything. She was just there to make sure we didn't do so much damage to any of the windows that we might escape. We weren't doing anything. Everyone had moved away from Tom's body. We all moved up a few seats and left it in the second to back seat of the bus. I told everyone to gather close. Megan Kozer had pretty much recovered from being stabbed, and the other kid that was stabbed didn't seem to be in shock anymore either. Listen, I said. Tom was right about one thing. People must be looking for us. If a kid goes missing, they wouldn't send the cops after them right away. But a whole bus of kids? They probably knew we didn't show up at school immediately. If Ruthie didn't call from the bus, she probably told the school as soon as she got there. So? Said a sophomore. They probably aren't going to find us all the way out here. Megan Kozer said. They might get a helicopter, and they are probably going to search all the roads. That could take hours, the kid said. Yeah, it could. I agreed. But if we got a single cell message out, they could probably start tracking our phones, or at least that phone. We don't know where we are, but we know we're between Lassen and Glastonbury, I said. But Lauren, we can't get any reception. None of us can, said Megan. I know, but think about it. The girl couldn't get a signal before we got to where we are now, so we know it isn't just the location. John was probably right. There's probably a jammer on the bus. A junior spoke up at that point. Yeah, but John looked for it and couldn't see it. Well, he didn't look very much, said Megan. Yeah, and that isn't the point anyway, I said. The jammer could be under the bus for all we know. So what the hell are we supposed to do about that? Said the sophomore. Maybe I should ask our girl up there if I can get off to search under the bottom of the bus. No, I said. Listen, you little moron. The jammer must have a limited range. It might cover the whole bus, but it won't reach all the way to the cabin, or at least it might not. Megan said, they haven't taken anything from anyone, at least that we've seen. Yeah, so if you start typing up what has happened and about where we are, and then hit send when they are taking you to the cabin, the text might get out, I said. We all looked up startled as the door opened and the gate slammed open. Sam Correa, who had been near the back of the group, had not been looking at me, stood up. I'll go, she said. As she walked past me, she had her cell phone in her hand. The screen was still on. There was a message on it, and her thumb was on the send button as she slipped her hand and phone into her pocket. She walked up to the big man. He moved aside and let her pass, and she walked down the aisle. The driver was a little leery, but let her walk past and Sam did nothing. Hands in her pocket, she followed the man with a stick off the bus, and then up to the cabin. The big man walked behind her with his hands on her shoulder. We gathered again. Sam did it. She must have been typing while we were talking, I said. How long do you think before someone shows up? Said the sophomore. I don't know, I said. It can't be long. Her message said we were off the eastbound lane of Route 132 between Lassen and Glastonbury, and to hurry. If anyone gets that message, they would have to be here pretty quick. In minutes, I would guess, said Megan. My uncle is a cop, she said. They get to this stuff pretty quickly. There aren't that many places to turn off. It's only 8 miles, said the sophomore. Then he also added, I'll go next. Stay huddled up, I said. Don't make it look like you're on your phones, or they'll think something is up. People have decried the educational value of the public school system. They've complained that we don't learn anything anymore. At least they say we don't learn anything useful. I'll tell you, that very kid on that bus, I learned how to text without looking, like they were even looking at their phone at all. Right then, that seemed like a pretty useful talent. It came back only a few minutes after that. The sophomore was true to his word. He stood up, sliding his hands into his pockets as he walked down the aisle. They marched him up to the cabin, and they came back. The kid that had been stabbed in the back volunteered to go next. It seemed like male teen bravado was going to keep all us girls safe until the end. But the minutes ticked by, and we couldn't hear sirens or anything. Megan, I said, how much longer would you think? If a message got out, I'd guess like 10 or 15 minutes. They probably already have state troopers on the highways looking. It's been 8 minutes since Sam went, I said. We all had our messages typed at that point. They were back, and the kid was stabbed got up. We all watched him go. As he was walking up to the cabin, he pulled away from the big man suddenly and pulled his cell phone out. You're fucked, he yelled. Your jammer ain't going to reach all the way up here. He had his cell phone screen aimed at the man. We heard the big man laugh at that point. He pulled something out of his pocket. It was a black, rectangular object. He said something, and the kid started to turn to run, starting to push frantically on his phone screen. He didn't get 5 feet before the man with the metal stick dropped him. The big man picked up the kid's phone and slipped it into the pocket of his black hoodie. He then dragged the kid to his feet roughly and slammed him into a tree. Holding the kid up for a second, he moved him a few steps down the path before letting him fall onto a rock that was sticking out of the ground. Oh my God, he has a jammer on him, Megan said too loud. The bus driver chortled. She crossed her arms and smiled. Her nose no longer bleeding. You little fuckers didn't think we knew what you were doing? She said more than asked. You're all fucked, she said. The big man kicked the kid off the rock and kicked him in the head again. The two men then picked him up and dragged him to the cabin. I looked over at where Steve Markle was. His body didn't have any steam rising out of it anymore. Next they took Megan. She didn't go meekly. She wrapped her arm around the outside of the bus window and tried to hold on. The big man was trying to grab at her ankles, but Megan flailed them around and he had a hard time grabbing her. The man with the stick just slid into the seat 2 up from her and touched her with it. She immediately fell. The big man grabbed her feet and dragged her into the aisle. She groaned as we saw her go down the aisle. We heard the sound of her head bouncing off each step of the bus as they took her out. The big man grabbed her up from the ground and threw her over his shoulder as they carried her up to the cabin. They came for us, and we went struggling or not after that, but either way, we went to the cabin. There are 3 of us left now. I'm going to be next, but I have a plan. I can't think that these jammers have a huge range. If they did, the man wouldn't have to carry one. So what I'm going to do is act like I'm doing what Megan did. I'm going to reach out the window, and I'm going to latch on. But when I reach out, I'm going to hit the send button on this text. And I'm going to fling my phone as far as I can into the woods. I'm hoping that the message will get sent when the phone passes beyond the range of the jammer. I wish I'd thought of that sooner. I don't suppose it will be enough to save the other 2 people on the bus, much less me. But at least our murderers won't go free.